Welcome to yet another episode of Game of Thrones Abridged. Today we are reading Bran 4, A Game of Thrones, the fourth Bran chapter. And this begins with Bran watching from the window as Rickon runs with the wolves. So again, we've got Bran watching. Ever since Bran fell, he's been doing a lot of watching, a lot of seeing, because of course his fate is to become a sort of magical seer, a seer who sees from the weirwood trees. Bran is all about vision and knowledge and magical psychic whoop-whoops, and that's hinted at by the watching that he's doing now. So meanwhile, Rickon is running with the wolves. So Rickon is in the absence of a lot of his family, with Rickon's parents out of Winterfell, with Jon gone. Everyone seems to be gone. So Rickon is left parentless, and he's being raised by the wolves, like Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. And they turned out alright, so maybe Rickon will too. So Rickon's going wild, Bran is watching. Rickon's playing with the wolves, Greywind and Shaggy Dog and Summer. And Summer's eyes. Summer's eyes that are... Oh, no. Well, no. This is a description of Shaggy Dog. So Shaggy Dog, Rickon's direwolf, is black with eyes of green fire, while Summer has eyes of yellow gold that see all there is to see. So Bran's direwolf Summer sees all there is to see, which is yet another repetition of this idea that Bran is a watcher. He's like Uatu the Watcher, that most strange of Marvel characters. He watches. And Bran also thinks that he's the smartest of the litter. And Bran's eyes sting. He's angry and he's frustrated because he can't get to run around with the wolves as Rickon does, because Bran is crippled. He cannot walk, he cannot move his legs, and so he is frustrated. But he doesn't cry, because he's almost a man grown now, too old to cry. His 8th name day has come and gone. So Bran is at the tender age of 8 years old at this point in time, and so Bran complains about how he doesn't get to run anymore, and he mentions the crow in his dream in last chapter. Remember, the three-eyed crow turned up in his dreams, and Bran calls the crow a liar, because he feels he can't fly. Like the crow said he could. And then Old Nan, who's in the room, says crows are all liars. And that is a hint, perhaps, that the three-eyed crow, Bloodraven, is indeed lying to Bran in some way. We know that the truth is that Bran actually truly can fly in the metaphorical sense. He does have these psychic powers, which Bloodraven calls flight, but Bloodraven might be lying about other things. Bloodraven is a very dark character, mysterious character, and while he is sort of the Gandalf to Bran's Frodo, as it were, he still perhaps cannot quite fully be trusted. But yeah, anyway, so Bran is really annoyed and frustrated and acting like a kid. And Old Nan, who is, of course, the old lady who tells stories in Winterfell, Old Nan's like, oh, I'll tell you a story. And Bran's like, I hate your stories. And Old Nan talks about the nature of stories. She talks about how the stories are. The stories are before me and after me and before you too. Old Nan has this sort of almost mystical ideas about the stories, the tales, the histories which precede us all. But Bran's just annoyed and acting like a kid, and yeah, he thinks about Old Nan. Apparently Old Nan is the oldest person in Winterfell, and maybe the oldest person in the Seven Kingdoms, though that more likely is Aemon Targaryen. Apparently Old Nan originally came to Winterfell as a wet nurse for Brandon Stark, but no one is quite sure which Brandon Stark, because there have been many Brandon Starks, whether it's the Bran of this chapter, or Brandon's uncle Bran, or Brandon the Bloody Builder, or there's lots of them. But yeah, Old Nan hangs around Winterfell, and yeah, we do get this sort of sense of confusion about history through this whole Brandon confusion. No one really quite knows the origins of Old Nan. But now she's just here. And it's mentioned that Hodor, poor sweet Hodor, is the grandson, I believe, of Old Nan, which is interesting. And they also think later about how it's weird that Hodor is so enormously tall. Hodor's like 7 feet tall, whereas Old Nan is just this tiny old woman, which sort of confuses Bran because, yeah, how is Hodor so big if Old Nan isn't? And there is a theory that's kind of cool, that Sir Duncan the Tall from the Duncan Egg books is the ancestor, the father of Hodor. Like that, or that he is the grandfather of Hodor, because there must have been another generation in between Hodor and Old Nan. But the point is, there could have been a sweet, cool little hookup between Old Nan and Sir Duncan the Tall back in the day, which is kind of cool. Any fucking way. So Bran's annoyed. Bran's acting like a kid. He's annoyed that he is crippled. He wants it to be the way it had been before. So Bran is grieving over the loss of his legs. He's sort of stuck wanting the past before he moves on towards the future later in his arc. But yeah, he knows it'll never be the way it had been. He had been in this coma for all this time, and when he woke up, he was broken, and the world had changed, and everyone had left him. So he talks about how sad he is, that his father has gone, and his mother has gone, and many of his siblings are gone, and he feels betrayed. And he talks about how Robb has stayed, but Robb has changed. Instead of being Robb the brother, Robb has become Robb the Lord. Because in the absence of Ned and Catelyn, Robb Stark has had to be the Stark in Winterfell. He's had to be responsible and a leader and strong and tough, which means he doesn't have as much time to be with Bran and to be Bran's brother. He's always training with the swords and talking with Maester Luwin and riding with the guards and doing all this important, responsible stuff. And Rickon is also suffering from the lack of the family. Rickon is crying a lot. And anyway, Old Nan's like, oh, come on, I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a story about Brandon the Builder, who, of course, is the Stark who supposedly founded House Stark and apparently built the wall. And they talk a bunch about all the different Brandons in history. It is interesting that there's this whole sort of historical continuity and confusion of Brandons when one of the POV characters is a Brandon Stark. There are some wacky theories about how, like, Bran is all of the different Brandons throughout history, like he's doing some kind of time travel shenanigans to be all the Brandons and do all the things. Which is pretty silly, but a fun thought anyway. And yeah, Old Nan is very confused about which Brandon Bran is. Sometimes Bran thinks that Bran is his uncle Bran or one of the other Brandons or blah blah blah, Brandon. But we talk about how Bran used to love scary stories, horror stories, and sort of the thematic resonance of that is that Bran's later arc becomes a horror story, what with the zombies chasing him and his friends dying and his tutelage under the skull-befuddled Bloodraven, that white corpse in the tree. Bran used to love horror stories, and then his life becomes one. And then Nan calls Bran a sweet summer child, and she goes into her story about the Long Night. So we're introduced to the concept of the Long Night, which was this time years and years and years and years ago when everything went dark and it was winter for a really long time, and the White Walkers came from the north for the first time to destroy everything alive. And she goes on to talk about the last hero, who's this mythological, legendary figure who apparently journeyed the north to try to find the Children of the Forest in order to reverse the darkness and find a way to defeat the White Walkers. And they talk about how the White Walkers have the legions of the armies of the dead, and they stalk the last hero with packs of pale white spiders big as hounds. And then just before we get to find out how the last hero defeated the White Walkers and turned away the Long Night, Nan's story gets interrupted. So we never get to find out what happened. One theory is, well, I mean, we are told later on that apparently the Children of the Forest do help the last hero. So one interpretation or speculation on this is that The last hero met with the Children of the Forest, and the Children of the Forest gave humanity obsidian, dragon glass, to fight back against the White Walkers. And then that was how the War for the Dawn was won, and the Long Night was ended, and everything went back to normal. That's one theory, but we don't really know the truth. And, of course, I mean, we've just had all this talk about Old Nan barely knows which Brandon is which, so it's very questionable whether this whole story of the Long Night and the Last Hero is even remotely true anyway. George Martin spends a lot of time showing us, like, the vagaries and confusion and uncertainty of history and myth and magic and prophecy. There is much that is unknown, so even when we're told that this is the way things happened, it may not be so. Because, of course, there are many other different accounts of how this shit went down. We also hear about Azor Ahai and Hyrkoon the hero who fought back the monsters and the demons over in Essos. Like, there are lots of different cultural accounts of how this darkness and the White Walkers and all this shit went down. So the point is we really don't know what the truth is at this point. But anyway, so Old Nan's story is interrupted when Maester Luwin and Hodor burst in, and Hodor says, Hodor, and he's smiling hugely. It is really sad seeing Hodor back in these early chapters, because remember, of course, as we learn in Game of Thrones Season 6, Bran made Hodor. Bran went through the time streams and sort of mind-fucked Hodor in such a way to change him from a normal, healthy young boy into Hodor, who is a nice boy, but is, without some of his faculties. So the tragedy of that sort of haunts Bran, or haunts the reader, rereading these early chapters. Anyway, so there are some visitors to Winterfell. Tyrion Lannister and some men of the Night's Watch have turned up, so Bran is expected to go greet them with the others. And on the way there, Bran reflects on the history of Hodor a bit. So yeah, there is that talk about how it's weird that Hodor is so tall and Old Nan isn't, so that supports the idea that Sir Dunk is involved somehow. But yeah, they talk about the mystery of why Hodor Hodors, because apparently his real name is Walder. In the show, his real name is Willis. I presume they changed that to prevent confusion with Walder Frey. But the point is that, yeah, Hodor used to be a healthy, normal boy, but then one day something went weird, and now he only says Hodor, and as we find out later, that was Bran's fault. And apparently that will be true in the books as well. It'll be different in the books, but it'll be essentially similar. Anyway, so the boys are hanging out in the Winterfell hall, and there's like there's a sort of a throne-ish seat described in Winterfell, the seat of the Starks, which is like this fancy marble chair with, not marble, but stone chair with dire wolves carved into it, which is kind of cool. In the show, they just have like an ordinary chair just sitting there, which is kind of less interesting, but whatever. But Robb is greeting Tyrion Lannister, and Robb is being quite hostile to Tyrion. He actually goes so far as to point at Tyrion with his drawn sword, which is a very aggressive move to make on a guest to your house. It seems as though Robb is acting very, very hostile to Tyrion because Robb knows about this whole supposed Lannister conspiracy against the Starks because of the business with Catelyn and Lysa's letter and the dagger and all that. Even though Tyrion is actually completely innocent, but Robb acts hostile. And yeah, so there's a bit of sort of tension and dialogue and drama, you know. Lannisters say, "Oh, you Starks are hard to kill," and Robb says, "Oh, you Lannisters better remember that." So there's all this conflict sort of bubbling up, even though Tyrion Lannister and Robb Stark really have nothing to fight about, really. And Bran sits down at the great seat of the Starks, and Tyrion studies him with his black and green eyes. And Tyrion asks about Bran's fall, and apparently Bran does not remember what happened in the fall. He doesn't remember that Jaime Lannister pushed him. Though, of course, we know the reason for that is that the Three-Eyed Crow pecked away his memories, did a memory removal procedure inside Bran's psychic representation of his mind, which is unethical, probably. But yes, it is quite interesting that Bran does not remember these things. And Tyrion calls Bran a cripple, and the word is a knife through Bran's heart, and he almost starts to cry. So Bran is clearly not yet, he has not yet accepted his being a cripple, his being unable to walk. You know, there's like stages of denial or stages of grief. The stages of grief, and like the first one, I think, is denial. Bran is in the denial phase of dealing with his new disability. And yeah, Bran's like, I'm not a cripple, and then Tyrion's like, well then I am no dwarf. My father will be overjoyed to hear it. Because Tyrion has all the best goddamn dialogue in this book. But the point is that Tyrion is giving Bran a gift. He's giving him a design for a saddle which will allow Bran to ride horses even though Bran is crippled. Because a similar design is used by Tyrion so that he can ride. As a dwarf, his stumpy little legs aren't so good for riding, so he adapts using his mind hole. Apparently, Tyrion drew up the designs himself, so Tyrion is quite clever, and his cleverness is benefiting Bran. Though Bran is a little bit sort of suspicious. He thinks, oh, maybe this is just another lie. So, similar to Arya, Bran is feeling betrayed by the people around him, and he's newly suspicious of everything. So that's a sort of a common thing that happens to a lot of the young characters in the first book. And yeah, so Tyrion's like, yep, I'm doing this kindness to Bran because I have a tender spot in my heart for cripples and bastards and broken things, which is a lovely line. And then Rickon bursts into the room. The dire wolves with him. The 3 wolves and Rickon burst into the room. And the wolves growl at Tyrion. Similar to Robb, they act hostile to Tyrion, and they creep up at him, and Greywind snaps at Tyrion's arm and actually rips some cloth off his shirt. And actually they knock Tyrion down. The wolves attack Tyrion. They don't hurt him, but they attack him. Which in Tyrion's words is interesting. And Robb looks sort of confused and shaken by this. After they call the wolves off, Robb's like, I don't know why they did that. And that is a very odd thing. Why do Summer, Grey Wolf, and Shaggy Dog attack Tyrion Lannister? Probably one of the better explanations would be that the hostility that Robb and perhaps Bran and Rickon are feeling towards Tyrion Lannister through some skin-changery wargy connection, psychic connection that they have with the wolves, that causes the wolves to attack because Robb is feeling hostile to Tyrion. That's one possible explanation. A different one might be that, like, this is foreshadowing of the whole sort of Stark-Lannister conflict, but I mean, Tyrion Lannister isn't really responsible for any of that, so it's weird that the wolves attack him. So that is a puzzling occurrence. Maybe someone else has some cool idea. Do the comment thing if you know why the wolves attack Tyrion like that. It is weird. Anyway, but Robb is a bit sort of thrown off by this happening, and he's like, oh, well, alright, sorry that we have been hostile to you, Tyrion. You've helped my brother Bran, so you're welcome to stay at Winterfell. And Tyrion's like, man, you obviously don't want me here. I'm out, yo. I'll go find a wench in an inn somewhere. And so he does. He leaves. And then after Tyrion leaves, they talk to the men of the Night's Watch, Yoren and his few blokes who have come looking for Night's Watch recruits. And so Robb gives a speech about how the Night's Watch is welcome at Winterfell, and Bran notices that the speech is very awkward. It's a speech that he had learned. So it's interesting seeing Robb sort of struggling a little bit here to take on the mantle of a leader at Winterfell. He's sort of still in his training wheels at this point, acting like a lord. But we see later on that he really gets a lot better at being a leader, so much so that he becomes king in the north until he gets killed. So the Night's Watch is here, and Bran gets carried back up to bed by Hodor. And he dreams. He dreams of climbing and climbing a tower, and then there are these weird gargoyles at the top of the tower, but the gargoyles are kind of lions, and Bran has to not listen to what the gargoyles are doing, otherwise he'll be in danger. And then the gargoyles approach him, and he cries and says, "I didn't hear," and then he wakes up. So what this dream represents is it's sort of a recount of the fall. So the lions are the Lannisters, Jaime and Cersei, who are fucking, and Bran is trying not to hear them because it's his knowledge of them screwing that causes Bran to fall from the tower. So we see that even though Bloodraven destroyed Bran's memory of the fall, he still seems to remember it in some kind of psychic back pocket of his head. So you wonder if maybe later on in the story he'll re-remember those memories, and it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to the knowledge that Jaime pushed him. By the time of dance, maybe it's irrelevant, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. Anyway, so he wakes up, and it's time to go down for dinner, and there's like a feast happening, and there's a long description of food with suckling pigs and pigeon pies, and the dire wolves are fighting over bones in the corner. Apparently the dogs don't come to the Winterfell Hall anymore because the dire wolves are there. Bran asks about what's going on with Jon Snow on the wall, and the Night's Watch just sort of laugh and say Sir Alice's Bane because of all that stuff's happening with Alliser Thorne and Jon at the wall. But yeah, they don't say much about what's going on with Jon. But then Bran also asks about, well, what about Uncle Benjen? And then the Night's Watch grows ominously quiet. And the Watch says that, yeah, sorry, but Benji's gone. Uncle Benji's gone. We don't know where he is. He went off to look for Waymar Royce and didn't come back. And so Bran's like, shit, this is bad. He thinks about the others, and he thinks about the last hero, and then he says, oh, well, the Children of the Forest will find him, just like the last hero in the story. The Children of the Forest will save Benjen. And interestingly, in the show, that is kind of what happens. Apparently the Children of the Forest found Benjen and put obsidian in his heart, and it turned him into a cold-handsy, whitey, monstery, resurrected bloke. It's unclear if anything like that will happen in the books, because it seems as though Cold Hands has kind of taken the role that Benjen has in the show. So it's uncertain what Benjen Stark's fate will be in the books. But in any case, in the here and now, Yoren and the Black Brothers are like, nah mate, Children of the Forest aren't real. Benjen's probably dead. And Robb and Bran don't accept that. So the feast ends, and Bran goes to bed, and Robb visits Bran in his chamber, and they have a chat, and basically they have this really sort of touching moment where Robb sort of takes off his lord hat. He stops trying to take on this sort of mantle of leader for now. He stops trying to be a strong, tough bloke, and for a moment he's Bran's brother again, and they show vulnerability to each other, and they talk about their hopes to see mother and father again, and they hope to go to the Wall to visit Jon, and so they're basically mourning the sundering of their family, and they have this touching moment of being brothers together, and they sob. They sort of cry, and they hold hands in the darkness. So there's this really sort of sweet, sad moment of the brothers reconnecting, because, while this is a story about, wars and politics and magic and children and zombies and such, it's also a story about a family who suffer every terrible thing that a family can suffer in the course of these books. The Stark family, who were really set up as the good guys from the very beginning, and who we remain connected to until the bitter end. And this is a moment of sadness and connection on the eve of the family's destruction. So thank you for listening to this episode. This chapter, I think, is about Bran coming to terms with his new reality. To some extent, it's about Robb and his growth as a character and him having to become a leader. And it also foreshadows a lot of the magical dark elements with the White Walkers and the Long Night and the mystery of what happened those thousands of years ago. Cheers.